You begin with a simple scientific question. How could the Earth enter a winter so long and so severe that it stretched across an entire human generation? A cold period not measured in months or even years, but in decades, long enough to shape cultures, redirect migrations, and change the course of human evolution. Scientists refer to such events collectively as abrupt climate shifts or cold pulses, and the Pleistocene era, the time in which early humans lived, experienced several of them. This documentary examines one of the most striking examples, a long winter triggered by a sudden climatic collapse, severe enough to reshape environments across continents. To understand the event, you start with the broader climate context. During the late Ice Age, Earth's climate was inherently unstable. Ice sheets covering North America and Eurasia were kilometers thick, constantly building and collapsing. Ocean circulation patterns shifted as giant meltwater pulses poured into the North Atlantic. When this happened rapidly, it disrupted the global conveyor system known as the thermohaline circulation, the deep ocean current that moves heat around the planet. If that circulation weakens or stops, temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere can drop dramatically in a very short time. This mechanism is likely behind several abrupt cold events, including the Younger Dryas, a well-known period when global temperatures fell sharply around 12,900 years ago. But earlier cold pulses, some lasting decades, occurred throughout the Pleistocene. Humans living during these times faced winters that did not end with spring. Seasons blurred, the cold persisted, plants struggled to grow, animal migration routes shifted drastically. Many populations of megafauna declined or moved to different regions. These long winters did not come with warning. They arrived quickly and reshaped the world for an entire generation. To understand how this felt on the ground, you look at what the environment would have become. Temperatures in northern regions may have dropped by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius within a human lifetime. Permafrost expanded southward, forests retreated, open steppe replaced woodland. Snow cover lasted longer each year, sometimes through the summer, preventing plants from regenerating. Rivers froze for much of the year, changing water availability. These changes were not subtle. They transformed landscapes on which early humans depended. Human groups living in Eurasia had to adapt immediately. Their diets shifted towards species able to survive in colder conditions. Reindeer, horse, and small mammals like hare and fox. Hunting strategies changed because hunters could no longer rely on predictable migrations. Large herds fragmented or moved unpredictably in search of grasslands not buried under snow. To survive, humans had to track animal paths more frequently, travel farther, and respond rapidly to environmental signals. These adjustments required highly flexible planning and cooperation. Archaeological evidence shows that during abrupt cold periods, campsites became more temporary. People moved more often, sometimes covering larger distances in shorter times. The frequency of hearth remains increases at some sites, suggesting the need for constant fire. Burn patterns and charcoal deposits indicate that groups collected every available type of fuel, not only wood, but also bone, peat, and dried plant material, to maintain heat. Fire was essential, not just for warmth, but for processing food, softening hides, and maintaining a stable living environment in extended cold. The long winter also altered tool-making traditions. As people moved through harsher landscapes, lightweight and efficient tools became more important. Stone points grew narrower and more aerodynamic, designed for high-speed throws using spear throwers. Scrapers became more specialized for processing hides into clothing that provided insulation. Bone needles, when they appear in the record, provide evidence for fitted garments that could withstand extreme temperatures. Much of the technology that allowed early humans to survive a generation-long winter was organic: wood, sinew, fiber, and therefore rarely preserved, but its presence is strongly supported by indirect evidence. One of the most important adaptations was clothing. During sustained cold, simple fur wraps were no longer enough. Humans needed multi-layered garments, fitted sleeves, sewn seams, and materials capable of blocking wind. Bone needles found in later layers confirm that such clothing existed, and hide processing tools show that production was systematic. Clothing is invisible in the archaeological record, but its creation was essential for survival in a climate where frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats. The long winter also affected human biology. Continuous cold increased energy demands, requiring higher calorie intake. Populations that survived tended to rely heavily on fat-rich diets, marrow, brain tissue, and stored animal fat. Over generations, bodies adapted physiologically. People in colder regions developed shorter limbs and broader torsos, shapes that conserve heat more effectively. These adaptations show up clearly in skeletal remains from cold-adapted populations across the Pleistocene. Social structures also changed. Small groups were forced to cooperate more closely to share resources and manage risk. Winter storms could isolate a camp for weeks. In such conditions, survival depended on stored food and coordinated effort. Groups with stronger communication, efficient planning, and clear division of labor had a higher chance of surviving a multi-decade cold event. These pressures likely strengthened social bonds, refined teaching systems, and improved the transmission of knowledge between generations. Even children's lives changed dramatically. Long winters limited outdoor movement, increasing the importance of indoor activities such as learning toolmaking, storytelling, and observation. These practices reinforced cultural continuity during times when mobility was restricted. A generation raised in extended winter developed sharper memory for landscapes, better risk assessment, and stronger cooperative instincts, qualities that shaped the human populations who lived after these cold periods ended. The ecological impacts were equally significant. When a long winter persisted, plant species declined or shifted southward. Herbivores followed. Predators adapted by changing their hunting ranges. Humans had to track these shifting ecosystems constantly. Archaeologists see evidence of such tracking in the distribution of tool traditions, which expand and contract in sync with resource availability. Regions that were once rich became barren, and humans abandoned them. Other areas that had previously held little value became essential hubs for survival. By the time such a winter began to warm, generations had grown up knowing only cold conditions. The transition back to milder climates required new adaptations, different hunting strategies, new plant foods, and broader mobility. But the skills developed during that long winter, flexible planning, cooperation, refined clothing, improved tools, remained part of human culture and helped shape later innovations. The winter that lasted a generation was not simply a climate event. It was a force that pressed humans into becoming more adaptive, more cooperative, and more resilient. And as this initial understanding settles, the next segment begins to form, exploring how these long winters started, what triggered them, and how they changed ancient ecosystems across continents. To understand a winter that lasted a generation, you have to examine the forces that start such extreme climate events. These winters do not arrive slowly. They begin abruptly, often within a decade or less, and their causes can be traced to specific disruptions in Earth's climate system. Scientists studying ice cores, sediment layers, and ocean chemistry have identified several mechanisms capable of triggering decade-scale cold periods. The most significant involve meltwater pulses, volcanic eruptions, and changes in atmospheric circulation. The first mechanism, and the one most likely responsible for multiple long winters in the Pleistocene, is a sudden influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic. During the Ice Age, massive glaciers held enormous volumes of water. When parts of these glaciers collapsed rapidly due to internal pressure, warming, or structural failure, they released torrents of meltwater into the ocean. These meltwater pulses were not small events. In some cases, they changed sea levels noticeably within a few years. When cold, low salinity water enters the North Atlantic in large amounts, it disrupts the thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt that moves warm water northward and cold water southward. This circulation is responsible for bringing warmth to northern regions. When it weakens or stops, heat transport shuts down. Europe and large parts of Asia cool rapidly. Some periods in the ice core record show temperature drops of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in a single decade, fast enough to affect a single human lifetime. The atmospheric effects follow quickly. Expanding sea ice reflects more sunlight, reinforcing cooling. Storm tracks shift southward, and precipitation patterns change. In a matter of years, mild summers vanish, and winter conditions settle in permanently. Volcanic activity is another potential trigger. Large eruptions inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, where they reflect sunlight and cool the planet. Most eruptions cause only temporary cooling, lasting a few years, but in rare cases, a cluster of eruptions or a single extremely large event can push the climate into a prolonged cold phase. Ash layers found in ice cores sometimes align with significant cooling events, suggesting that volcanic forcing may have played a role in some generation-long winters. However, volcanic cooling alone is usually not enough to maintain decades of low temperatures. It is more likely to trigger feedback loops in the climate system that extend the cooling. A third mechanism involves shifts in atmospheric circulation, particularly in the position of the jet stream. During the Ice Age, the jet stream was highly sensitive to changes in ocean temperature, sea ice extent, and topography created by the ice sheets. When the jet stream shifted far south, warm air masses could no longer reach northern regions. Storms intensified, snowfall increased. Long-lasting snow cover prevented sunlight from warming the ground, leading to further cooling. These circulation shifts are visible in climate models and leave recognizable patterns in geological evidence. To understand how these events affected the world humans lived in, you look at stable isotope data from Greenland ice cores. These cores preserve annual layers of snow that record temperature, precipitation, and atmospheric conditions. In several periods, the cores show sudden transitions from warmer interglacial conditions to extreme cold. The transitions are sharp, not gradual shifts over centuries, but clear drops within the first few layers representing only a handful of years. Such abrupt cooling is the hallmark of a shutdown in ocean circulation, supported by changes in calcium, sodium, and methane concentrations in the ice. Sediment cores from the North Atlantic tell a similar story. Layers containing freshwater-loving microorganisms appear suddenly, indicating massive influxes of meltwater. Coarse rock fragments carried by icebergs show up far south of their normal range. These findings together depict an ocean system in crisis, the kind of disruption that can push Europe and parts of Asia into extended winter conditions. When the cold settles in, ecosystems respond immediately. In Europe, forests shrink. Pine and birch disappear from regions they once dominated. Grasslands expand, but struggle under persistent snow cover. Mammal populations shift rapidly. Cold-adapted species like reindeer thrive temporarily, while others decline. Smaller mammals become more important for human diets because their populations can adapt faster to changing plant availability. Across Asia, similar patterns emerge. Dryness increases in some regions as storm tracks shift. Lakes shrink. Rivers freeze earlier and thaw later. Nomadic groups that once followed predictable routes find them disrupted. Water sources become unreliable. These environmental pressures force constant adjustment. In Africa, the effects of a northern winter can create opposite patterns. Monsoon systems weaken, reducing rainfall. Grasslands contract. Some areas become more arid, pushing human groups closer to reliable water sources. Even though Africa did not experience the same deep freeze as northern regions, the global cooling had ripple effects that reshaped migratory patterns and survival strategies. The important point is that these long winters were not local events. They were global reorganizations of climate systems. Their origins lay in ocean and atmosphere interactions, but their consequences reached every continent. Humans everywhere had to adapt, some by shifting diet, some by moving to new territories, some by altering their technology. Generation-long winters are recorded in multiple points of Earth's history. Each one left ecological scars, redirected human movement, and shaped the development of early cultures. They were not pauses in time, but powerful filters, events that tested resilience and forced innovation. As this understanding settles, the next segment begins to form, examining how human populations responded during the first years of an abrupt, decades-long winter, and what daily survival looked like for the groups caught inside it. When a long winter begins abruptly, the first challenge is not adaptation, it is shock. Early human groups living at the end of a relatively stable climatic phase would have experienced the beginning of such a winter as an unexpected shift in the seasons. A cold year is manageable. Even 2 cold years can be survived. But when temperatures fail to rise after several summers, when plants do not recover, and when animal migrations break down, the situation becomes something entirely different. The first years of a generation-long winter were the most dangerous because people had no memory of such a shift and no established strategies to manage it. Archaeological models suggest that the earliest sign of trouble for Ice Age communities would have been the disappearance of seasonal plants. Edible roots, berries, nuts, and leafy greens became scarce when snow cover persisted longer than usual. Plant growth depends on a predictable cycle of warmth and sunlight, and when that cycle collapses for Several years in a row, entire categories of food disappear. For groups that relied on seasonal plant gathering to supplement their diet, this would have been a critical loss. Animal behavior shifted just as quickly. Large herbivores, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, and horses depended on plant availability. When grasslands remained covered with snow and ice into the warm months, herds moved long distances in search of food. Migration routes became erratic. Traditional hunting grounds went empty. Some animals regrouped in shrinking pockets where vegetation remained accessible. Others declined rapidly. These changes forced humans to follow unpredictable paths, often into colder or more dangerous areas than before. The archaeological record shows that during these first years of abrupt cooling, human mobility increased significantly. Campsites became more transient, with fewer layers of occupation. Groups moved frequently, attempting to track surviving herds or locate plant-rich microenvironments. This increased mobility also increased risk. Traveling through unknown terrain exposed hunters to predators, weather events, and the threat of getting trapped by storms. In several regions, evidence suggests groups abandoned previously stable territories entirely. Fire use intensified. Hearths from this era contain thicker layers of ash and show more frequent rebuilding. People burned whatever they could find, wood where available, but also bone and dried grasses. Burning bone is less efficient, but it produces long-lasting heat, useful in areas where firewood became scarce. The presence of heat-altered bones at many sites indicates heavy reliance on this strategy, especially during the early years of the long winter. Clothing became essential within a few years. Basic fur wraps that worked in normal Ice Age conditions were insufficient for sustained cold. The need for insulated garments grew quickly. Bone needles, when found in layers corresponding to abrupt cooling events, hint at a rapid shift toward tailored clothing with seams, fitted shapes, and multiple layers. Hides were processed more thoroughly, creating wind-resistant materials necessary for traveling long distances in cold climates. Shelters changed as well. Temporary open-air structures were no longer enough. Groups built more robust windbreaks, used bone and wood frames more frequently, and insulated shelters with packed vegetation or layers of skin. In particularly cold regions, some groups may have partially excavated living spaces to reduce exposure. Archaeologists occasionally find depressions and patterns consistent with dugout shelters from this era, suggesting a strategic change in how people protected themselves from extended cold. Food storage practices became more important in the first years of the long winter. Humans, who previously relied on daily gathering and fresh hunting, now had to preserve food for longer periods. Drying meat, storing fat, and creating caches in frozen soil became crucial survival tactics. Even though storage pits rarely survive intact, cut marks and bone distributions around early cold period sites suggest long-term planning for winter shortages. This marks one of the earliest broad shifts from short-term to delayed return subsistence strategies. Social dynamics shifted under pressure. Smaller groups began merging more frequently for safety and cooperation. Larger combined camps offered shared labor for shelter building, more hunting capacity, and better risk management. Genetic patterns from these periods indicate increased mixing between groups, supporting the idea that challenging climates encourage cooperation and merging rather than isolation. Daily life changed in measurable ways. Children were kept closer to camp, leading to stronger teaching traditions. Toolmaking became a more central activity as groups needed reliable equipment to hunt in unpredictable conditions. Nighttime fire maintenance became a constant responsibility, rotating among adults who ensured that a flame was always available in freezing temperatures. Psychological adaptation also played a role, though it leaves no direct archaeological trace. A generation that knew nothing but cold would grow up with different expectations of the environment. Stories, warnings, and knowledge systems adjusted accordingly. People learned to read subtle signs of weather, track scarce resources, and identify safe migration routes. These skills formed the cultural backbone for survival through extended winters. Within only a few years of abrupt cooling, humans were living in a world transformed. Food sources shifted, landscapes changed, and survival required constant adaptation. The groups that managed to reorganize quickly, improving clothing, altering hunting strategies, strengthening cooperation, stood the best chance of crossing from the initial shock phase into a sustainable pattern of life under prolonged cold. As this understanding settles, the next segment begins to take shape, examining what daily life looked like not just in the first years, but in the middle of the long winter, when survival systems were fully established and humans had adapted to a world that remained cold year after year. Once the first shock of abrupt climate collapse passed, early humans entered a different phase of survival, one defined not by crisis, but by routine. By the middle of a generation-long winter, people had adjusted to the new conditions. The cold was no longer unexpected or temporary. It had become reality. And when a harsh environment becomes predictable, humans build systems around it. These systems, invisible in many ways, but supported by archaeological clues, tell us how people lived, organized, and thrived in a world where winter never truly ended. At this stage, mobility patterns stabilized. Instead of wandering continuously in search of unpredictable food sources, groups established regular seasonal rounds, returning to the few areas where resources remained reliably accessible. These zones often included sheltered valleys, river corridors where ice melted periodically, south-facing slopes with slightly warmer microclimates, and places where animals gathered during the scarce warm months. Evidence for these repeated occupations appears in the form of stacked hearths, layered refuse zones, and clusters of stone flakes built up over time. Hunting strategies had also become more structured. Rather than following erratic migrations blindly, humans learned which species could be counted on through the long winter. Reindeer remain one of the most important examples. Their physiology allows them to graze on buried vegetation, making them resilient during cold periods. Humans developed efficient ways to hunt reindeer, intercepting herds at narrow passes, using natural features like frozen riverbanks to channel movement, and coordinating multi-person ambushes. These techniques required cooperation and precise timing. Small game hunting grew more important as well. Hare, fox, ptarmigan, and other cold-adapted animals offered reliable protein when large game was scarce. Archaeological sites from long cold phases often contain high volumes of small animal bones with distinct cut marks. This signals a diversification of diet, a sign that humans were optimizing every available food source. Fishing also continued, whenever river ice broke or at springs that remained unfrozen. Bonefish hooks and barbed points, fragile but occasionally preserved, confirm this. Clothing reached its highest importance in the middle of the long winter. By this point, sewing was a widely practiced skill. Bone needles became standardized, carefully polished with eyes large enough for thread made from sinew. Multiple layers of clothing allowed groups to hunt in temperatures far below freezing. Some evidence suggests the use of tailored hoods, mittens, and insulated footwear, items that rarely survive but are supported by hide processing tools, and the presence of highly worn needles. Fire management became an essential part of daily routine. Groups maintained hearths continuously, using bone fuel when wood was limited. Burn patterns show repeated heating of stones, likely used to warm shelters or assist in cooking. Ash layers in some sites grow several centimeters deep, indicating that fire was central not only for warmth, but for tool-making, light, and food preparation. People living in the long winter could not afford to let a fire die. Starting a new one in severe cold was risky, and resources for ignition were scarce. Shelter technology improved significantly. Groups built structures that reduced exposure to wind and retained heat more effectively. Frames made from mammoth bones appear at some sites, suggesting large, semi-permanent shelters. In other regions, wooden frames were covered with layered hides, insulated with grass or moss. Some shelters were partially dug into the ground for temperature stability. These improvements are seen indirectly in soil discoloration, concentrations of post holes, and arrangements of stones used to weigh down coverings. The long winter encouraged people to invest energy in building shelters that could withstand months of continuous cold. Inside these shelters, life took on a structured rhythm. Food preparation, hide processing, tool making, and child rearing all occurred in confined spaces. Spatial organization appears in archaeological layers, piles of debitage indicating tool-making zones, concentrated ash suggesting a central hearth, and bone distributions showing food areas. These patterns reflect an understanding of spatial efficiency and hygiene in enclosed environments. Social roles became more defined. Stronger cooperation was not optional, it was essential. Some individuals specialized in tool making, others in hide work, others in hunting, and others in maintaining fire or caring for children. Specialization appears indirectly through consistent craftsmanship styles and the presence of multiple identical tools within a single camp. These patterns suggest that knowledge was taught and maintained systematically. Information sharing expanded during the long winter. Groups exchanged knowledge about safe travel routes, animal behavior, and hazardous areas. Storytelling and oral teaching became stabilizing forces, helping younger members understand a world where mistakes carried high risk. Cognitive adaptation also appeared in memory systems. Understanding when and where food would be available, even under unpredictable conditions, required strong mental mapping abilities. Social gatherings with neighboring groups likely continued, though less frequently due to harsh travel. When they occurred, they played important roles in mate exchange, information flow, and cultural continuity. Genetic evidence supports this. Even during cold phases, human populations continued mixing, suggesting that alliances and shared territories remained vital. Children growing up in the middle of the long winter experienced a different childhood from the generations before. their learning focused early on practical survival, recognizing tracks in snow, helping maintain fire, sorting bones for fat extraction, and identifying safe shelters. Their cognitive development aligned with these demands, and their cultural worldview was shaped by an environment where cold was constant rather than exceptional. Despite the difficulties, humans adapted well. Archaeological evidence shows continuity, not collapse. Groups reorganized, improved their technology, and established rhythms suited to long-term cold. What looked catastrophic in the first years became manageable through innovation, cooperation, and resilience. As this picture settles into place, the next segment begins to form, focusing on how extended cold transformed the landscape itself, reshaping animal populations, plant, communities, and the ecosystems humans depended on. To understand the full impact of a winter that lasted a generation, you have to look beyond human adaptation and examine how the environment itself was transformed. Extended cold does not just change temperature, it reorganizes ecosystems. Animals migrate or disappear. Plants shift their ranges. Entire food webs restructure. These ecological changes determined what resources humans could rely on, how far they had to travel, and which strategies allowed them to survive. The first major change occurred in plant communities. During normal Ice Age cycles, tundra and grassland plants reappeared each spring. But during a prolonged winter, snow cover persisted, blocking sunlight and shortening the growing season dramatically. Many plant species could not complete their growth cycle. Shrubs and grasses that normally returned each year began to decline. Tree species such as birch and pine retreated southward, shrinking forested areas. This shift is recorded in pollen layers taken from lake sediments. Pollen from cold-adapted species increases sharply. Pollen from temperate species drops almost to zero. Without healthy plant communities, herbivore behavior changed rapidly. Large mammals, dependent on grazing or browsing, had to travel farther to find edible vegetation. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses moved into areas that still had exposed grasses, often windswept plains where snow did not accumulate heavily. Reindeer, already adapted to harsh conditions, continued to thrive but shifted their migration routes. Horses, which required more accessible vegetation, became less predictable in their movements. As these animals shifted or declined, predators followed them, creating cascading effects across the ecosystem. These changes are reflected in bone assemblages from human sites. Species composition alters noticeably in layers associated with prolonged cold. Reindeer become more common, while remains of more temperate species fade. Small game remains increase, indicating that humans compensated for changing large game availability by diversifying their hunting. Fox, hare, and ptarmigan, all capable of surviving in snowy environments, appear more consistently. Fishbones, though fragile, sometimes survive in contexts where humans exploited rivers and springs that remained ice-free. Additionally, scavenging patterns changed. With more animals dying from environmental stress, predators and scavengers, including humans, encountered carcasses more often. Cut marks on bones from this period reveal efficient stripping techniques, suggesting that people took advantage of every available calorie. Bone marrow, a critical fat source, became even more important in extended cold, and breakage patterns confirm systematic extraction. Water systems were also deeply affected. Many lakes and rivers froze for most of the year. Glacial melt, which normally provided fresh water in warmer cycles, slowed dramatically. Some river systems fragmented, forming temporary ice dams that could break unpredictably, causing floods. Humans had to understand these hazards to survive. Settlement patterns show a tendency to camp near springs, geothermal areas, or river sections that remained unfrozen, small pockets of reliable water in a landscape dominated by ice. Predator-prey relationships shifted. As prey species moved or declined, predators like wolves and big cats changed their ranges. Humans sometimes followed these patterns, using predator tracks to identify remaining animal concentrations. In other cases, humans and predators competed directly for scarce resources. Predator remains found near human sites hint at occasional conflict as groups protected stored meat or defended shelters during severe storms. Plant availability had long-term consequences. Even in the heart of a long winter, some hardy plants persisted: mosses, lichens, and a few cold-resistant shrubs. These plants form the base of the food chain for animals like reindeer, allowing humans to rely on those species indirectly. But edible plants for human consumption remained scarce. This scarcity pushed humans to rely heavily on animal-based diets, meat, fat, marrow, and organs, which provided the high caloric density needed to function in extreme cold. Another ecological factor was wind. During extended cold phases, powerful winds swept across exposed plains, removing snow from some areas while piling it deeply in others. These patterns influenced where plants could survive and where animals gathered. Humans learned to read wind patterns. Areas with thin snow often held hidden vegetation that attracted animals, creating ideal hunting opportunities. Wind-exposed slopes also provided safer travel routes and reduced the risk of getting trapped in deep snow. The most profound ecological transformation was the compression of habitable zones. As cold intensified, landscapes that once supported diverse life became barren. Humans, animals, and plants crowded into smaller regions where conditions remained survivable. These refugees, often located in southern Europe, Central Asia, or coastal corridors, became crucial for the persistence of species. Genetic evidence shows that many species, including humans, bottlenecked into these clusters during long cold phases. After the winter ended, populations expanded again from these refugees, reshaping the distribution of life across continents. These ecological shifts reveal why prolonged winter phases were so significant. They did not simply challenge human groups. They reorganized the resources available to them. People who survived did so by reading the changing environment accurately, understanding where animals would go, where vegetation persisted, where water remained accessible, and how ecosystems reorganize themselves under pressure. By the middle of a generation-long winter, humans were no longer reacting to a sudden catastrophe. They had learned to work with a transformed ecosystem, relying on new species, new patterns, and new strategies. The landscape had changed, and humans changed with it. As this ecological picture settles, the next segment begins to form, exploring how social structure, cooperation, and group organization evolved under the pressures of extended cold, and how these developments shaped later human societies. As the generation-long winter deepened, survival depended less on individual skill and more on the strength of the group. Environmental pressure reconfigured human societies from the inside out. cooperation, division of labor, and shared knowledge became the only dependable strategies in a world where resources were limited, mobility was dangerous, and mistakes carried immediate consequences. These pressures did not create new human abilities, but they intensified behaviors already present, pushing early societies toward more structured and resilient forms of organization. One of the clearest effects of prolonged cold was the tightening of group bonds. Archaeological evidence from this period shows consistent patterns of shared activity zones, repeated communal hearths, and coordinated hunting strategies. These patterns suggest that groups operated with higher levels of cooperation than in warmer periods when resources were more abundant and forgiving. Cold reduces the margin for error. Under such conditions, humans were compelled to strengthen internal cohesion. Division of labor became more defined. In smaller, mobile groups, everyone performed most tasks. But in sustained cold, specialization provided efficiency. Skilled individuals produced high-quality tools, while others focused on hide processing, fire maintenance, or scouting for game. Specialization is visible indirectly in tool assemblages. Repeated production of identical blade forms or consistently refined hide-scraping tools suggests practiced craftspeople. Over time, these specialized roles help stabilize group functioning, ensuring that essential tasks were always carried out by those most capable. Knowledge transmission also became more structured. Teaching was no longer optional or informal. Children needed survival skills early, the ability to read snow conditions, track reindeer, identify wind patterns, locate water, and prepare hides. Evidence for structured teaching appears in the standardization of tool shapes and the continuity of hunting methods across generations. Even without written language, these traditions required robust oral systems and a shared cultural framework. Group size changed as well. Harsh conditions often forced smaller bands to join with others, forming temporary or long-term alliances. These merged groups were better equipped to handle the demands of winter. More hunters meant a higher chance of successful hunts. More gatherers and processors meant faster preparation of resources. More adults meant more consistent care for children. Genetic data from similar cold periods shows increased mixing between groups, which supports the idea of broadened social networks under climatic stress. Conflict patterns likely changed too. In times of abundance, groups could afford territorial disputes. In prolonged winter, cooperation was often more beneficial than conflict. Shared refuges, small regions with tolerable conditions, became hubs where multiple groups overlapped. Archaeological sites from these refugees show mixed tool traditions, suggesting cultural blending rather than separation. Resource sharing, joint hunting efforts, and intergroup marriages may have helped stabilize populations and reduce competition. Social roles expanded in response to new needs. The maintenance of fire was a critical responsibility, often assigned to specific individuals. Firekeepers ensured a steady flame for warmth, cooking, and tool production, a task essential to group survival. Skilled navigators, familiar with snow patterns and safe routes, guided migrations. Toolmakers crafted the weapons and implements needed for hunting and daily tasks. Storytellers played a role too, preserving knowledge about landscapes, traditions, and past challenges. These roles were not ceremonial. They served practical functions that helped societies endure extended cold. Elders gained increased importance. In prolonged winter, long-term knowledge was invaluable. Elders who remembered environmental patterns, migration routes, or rare resource patches became central figures for decision-making. Their advice could determine whether a group chose a safe shelter or risked a dangerous crossing. In this sense, the generation-long winter amplified the role of accumulated wisdom, reinforcing social respect for those with deep experience. Cooperation expanded beyond resource gathering. Groups had to work together to build insulated shelters, process large animal kills quickly before they froze, and manage food stores. These cooperative tasks strengthened social bonds. Archaeological signs of shared butchering sites, where multiple individuals processed a single animal, indicate coordinated work. The structured layout of some cold period camps also suggests planning beyond the needs of a single family. Trade and exchange continued, even under harsh conditions. People still encountered neighboring groups at seasonal refuges, exchanging materials such as stone, bone, pigments, or crafted tools. These interactions helped maintain genetic diversity and allowed ideas to spread across regions. Even during extended cold, humans preserved the habit of creating and maintaining social networks. Decision-making structures evolved in response to risk. Groups likely relied on consensus or leadership based on expertise. Individuals who understood weather patterns, animal behavior, or safe migration routes. Leadership during this period was not symbolic, it was functional. The safety of the entire group depended on informed choices. The long winter also strengthened emotional bonds. Living in close quarters, sharing resources, facing danger together, and relying on each other for survival enhanced trust and interdependence. These emotional structures formed the groundwork for more complex societies that emerged thousands of years later. Cooperation under stress refined the social instincts that would eventually support larger settlements, trade networks, and collective agriculture. By the middle of a generation-long winter, human societies had transformed into highly coordinated, resilient units. The structure of daily life was shaped by necessity, but the systems that emerged, cooperation, specialization, leadership, teaching, became permanent features of human culture. As this understanding settles, the next segment begins to form, exploring how prolonged cold affected human movement and migration on a continental scale, creating pathways and population shifts that influence where people lived long after the winter ended. When a winter lasts for decades, it does more than change daily life. It reshapes the map of human movement. People no longer travel according to familiar seasonal rhythms. Instead, they follow the shifting boundaries of cold, searching for the few remaining zones where survival is possible. A generation-long winter compresses populations, redirects migrations, and creates new pathways that can alter human history for thousands of years afterward. To understand this, you look at the climate patterns of prolonged cold. As temperatures fell, ice expanded outward from northern latitudes. Glaciers pushed into valleys, covering former hunting grounds. Tundra vegetation replaced forests, and open plains turned into barren, wind-scoured surfaces. In these conditions, most regions north of roughly 45 degrees latitude became extremely difficult to inhabit. Human groups who once lived comfortably across Europe, Northern Asia, and parts of North America were forced to move southward into more temperate environments. Archaeological data supports this compression. Many sites in northern Europe show abandonment layers corresponding to cold pulses. The tools, hearths, and debris stop abruptly, replaced by sterile layers of wind-deposited sediment. Meanwhile, sites farther south, in France, the Balkans, the Levant, and parts of Central Asia, show increased occupation intensity with thicker layers of debris and more frequent reuse. These areas acted as climatic refuges, capable of supporting life even during extended cold. Within these refuges, populations grew. Genetic evidence from ancient DNA shows that certain regions, especially parts of southern Europe and Western Asia, served as long-term population reservoirs. During warm periods, people had expanded north from these zones. During extended cold, they contracted back into them. This pattern repeated multiple times throughout the Ice Age, but a winter that lasted a generation intensified the process, creating tighter clusters of people and more frequent mixing between groups. This compression had major cultural consequences. Groups who rarely interacted in warmer times were now living closer together. Tool styles blended, hunting strategies merged, languages likely influenced one another. Concentrated populations in these refuges formed the ancestral basis for later expansions once the climate warmed again. In Asia, similar patterns emerge. Northern Siberia, which supported small but stable human populations during mild periods, became extremely challenging during prolonged cold. Steppe and forest belts retracted southward, pushing people towards Central Asia's river valleys and mountain foothills. Archaeological sites in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the Altai region show increased occupation at times when northern areas empty out. These regions offered access to water, migratory animals, and diverse plant life, a rare combination in a cold world. Farther southeast, populations near China's Yellow River and the foothills of the Tibetan Plateau also show continuity through cold phases. These regions may have served as eastern refuges similar to those in Europe. After the cold ended, populations expanded from these zones into previously abandoned territories, reshaping the genetic and cultural makeup of East Asia. In Africa, the effects were indirect but significant. Global cooling weakened monsoon systems, reducing rainfall across much of the continent. Grasslands contracted. Some regions became drier, pushing populations towards stable water sources like major rivers and coastal zones. These environmental pressures may have increased movement along the Nile corridor and contributed to population clustering in eastern and southern Africa. Even though the continent did not freeze, human migrations there still reflect the global impact of prolonged cold. Land bridges and exposed coastlines also played a role. During Ice Age cold phases, sea levels dropped significantly, sometimes by more than 100 meters. Coastlines extended outward, revealing plains that connected regions now separated by water. The winter itself did not create these land bridges, but the conditions it maintained preserved them. Humans were able to migrate along exposed coastal routes, taking advantage of fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. These coastal corridors may have served as vital lifelines during times when inland areas became too harsh. The reduction in habitable zones also forced humans into tighter ecological relationships with animals. As large herbivores moved south, humans followed. This movement shaped migration routes that later influenced patterns of settlement and cultural spread. When the climate warmed again and populations re-expanded, they carried with them the knowledge, technologies, and cultural traditions formed in these refuges. This is one reason why post-Ice Age archaeological cultures appear so cohesive across large regions. They originated from population clusters that had developed shared systems during prolonged cold. Migration during a generation-long winter was not a single wave. It was a dynamic process, groups adjusting their routes as snow depth changed, as rivers froze or thawed, as animals shifted their grazing zones. Some groups moved repeatedly, others settled into refuges for decades. These patterns left faint traces, repeated occupation layers, stone from distant sources, genetic signatures revealing episodes of mixing and separation. The key point is that extended cold reshaped the human map. It concentrated populations where life remained possible and emptied vast areas of land. When the winter ended, these compressed populations expanded outward again, repopulating empty territories and spreading their cultural traditions across continents. As this broader picture of movement settles, the next segment begins to form, examining how prolonged cold influenced human technology, pushing innovation forward even when materials were scarce and environmental conditions were unforgiving. When the environment becomes harsher, technology does not slow down. It accelerates. A generation-long winter created pressures that forced early humans to refine their tools, expand their techniques, and invent new ways to survive conditions that no previous generation had faced. The archaeological record from the periods surrounding these prolonged cold phases reveals an unmistakable pattern. Technological progression increases when survival becomes more difficult. One of the clearest signs of innovation is seen in hunting equipment. Large herbivores that survived the long winter, reindeer, muskox, and occasional mammoths, became more difficult to hunt. Their movements were unpredictable, and deep snow altered how hunters could track and ambush them. To counter this, early humans refined projectile weapons. Stone points from cold phase sites show narrower, more aerodynamic shapes designed for penetration through thick hides and dense winter fur. These points also required skill to produce, reflecting the growing expertise of toolmakers who practice their craft consistently during extended periods indoors. The atlatl, or spear thrower, may have gained more widespread use during long winter periods. Though direct evidence is rare because these devices were usually made of wood, indirect evidence, such as the size and shape of stone points, suggests an increase in long-distance hunting tools. A spear thrower adds leverage and force, allowing hunters to strike from farther away or from safer angles. In a winter landscape where approaching prey too closely carried high risk, this advantage could be decisive. Clothing technology was another major area of innovation. By the midpoint of a generation-long winter, simple fur coverings were insufficient. People needed fitted garments that trapped warm air, blocked wind, and allowed movement in deep snow. Bone needles became common in many regions, and the wear patterns on them show heavy use. This indicates that sewing became a core survival skill. The resulting garments likely included layered trousers, insulating boots, tailored hoods, and mittens. The earliest versions of cold weather clothing humans still rely on today. Improved hide processing accompanied this development. Scrapers used to soften, and thin hides show intense use wear, sometimes polished from repeated contact with skin and fat. Groups developed better techniques for removing hair from hides, creating pliable material suitable for sewing. These refinements point to an organized system of clothing production, with certain individuals specializing in hide preparation, while others focused on sewing or tool production. Shelter building also evolved. Temporary structures were no longer enough, and humans began building more durable, insulated living spaces. Archaeological traces suggest the use of mammoth ribs and large wooden beams to form frames, covered with thick hides and sealed with moss or soil to block wind. In some regions, shelters were partially dug into the ground to take advantage of stable subsurface temperatures. While little of this survives today, soil depressions, stone alignments, and post holes provide clear evidence of these innovations. Fire technology advanced as well. Maintaining a reliable fire source during extended cold was essential. People experimented with different ignition methods and fuel types. Bone fuel, though less efficient than wood, burns with a steady flame and was often used when timber was scarce. Residue analysis shows repeated burning of bones in many cold period sites, confirming its role as a consistent heat source. Heated stones also became more common, used for cooking, drying meat, or heating shelters by transferring warmth into insulated pits. Another area of innovation was food processing. During prolonged winter, high-energy foods were crucial. Humans refined techniques to extract marrow, boil bones to release fat, and preserve meat through drying or smoking. Boiling was likely accomplished using heated stones dropped into hide or bark containers, a method that leaves behind characteristic cracked stones. This technique allowed groups to extract nutrients not accessible through simple roasting, improving winter survival significantly. Transport technology improved as well. The presence of shaped wooden poles and antler fragments suggests the use of sled-like implements for dragging materials across snow. These sleds would have made it easier to move meat, hides, or children over long distances. Though fragile and rarely preserved, such transport tools were practical responses to frozen landscapes. Stone toolkits diversified. Instead of a few general-purpose tools, people used specialized scrapers, burins for fine carving, blades for processing meat, and heavy-duty adzes for woodworking. The diversification reflects increasing efficiency. Each tool designed for a specific task that allowed the group to maximize limited resources. Crafting these tools required precision and knowledge passed through generations. Resource selection became more strategic. Humans began identifying the best sources of high-quality stone and traveling long distances to obtain it. Obsidian, chert, and fine-grained flint were preferred for creating sharp, durable edges. The presence of these materials far from their natural sources indicates planned acquisition and possibly exchange between groups, even during harsh conditions. Innovation extended into social organization. With specialization becoming more common, groups learned to rely on coordinated labor. Large game hunts required intricate planning. Shelter construction demanded group effort. Clothing production relied on multiple steps performed in sequence. These activities represent early forms of cooperative engineering, coordinated tasks with shared goals, guided by expert knowledge. What stands out is that the long winter did not hinder technological development. It accelerated it. The pressures of the environment forced humans to refine their tools, invent new techniques, and maintain robust teaching systems. When the climate eventually warmed, These innovations persisted, forming the technological foundation for later cultural expansion. As this understanding settles, the next segment begins to take shape, examining how prolonged cold influenced human diet, metabolism, and health, revealing how bodies adapted biologically to endure years of extreme winter. A winter that lasts for decades forces changes not only in technology and behavior, but in the human body itself. Survival in continuous cold requires more calories, more fat, and different metabolic strategies than life in milder climates. Archaeological, genetic, and physiological evidence together show that prolonged winter phases shaped human biology in subtle but measurable ways. To understand how people endured these conditions, we look closely at what they ate, how they processed food, and how their bodies adapted to long-term cold stress. The most immediate dietary change was the shift toward animal-based foods. During these extended cold periods, plants that normally provided essential vitamins, carbohydrates, and fibers were scarce or absent for most of the year. Snow cover limited access to roots and berries, and short growing seasons prevented meaningful plant recovery. Humans turned increasingly to large herbivores and small game for sustenance. Reindeer, in particular, became a key resource because of their abundance, mobility, and ability to graze on lichens beneath the snow. The nutritional profile of this diet was markedly different. Meat provided protein and minerals, but the critical component was fat. In cold environments, fat is essential for maintaining body temperature and delivering high-calorie energy. Humans living through a generation-long winter consumed large quantities of marrow, brain tissue, and stored fat. Cut mark patterns on bones from these periods show careful processing to extract every usable calorie. Long bones were cracked with precision, and skulls were opened systematically to reach nutrient-rich tissues. Boiling food became especially important. When archaeologists find cracked, heat-altered stones in repeated layers, it indicates that groups were heating rocks in fire and dropping them into hide-lined pits to cook food. Boiling extracts fat and gelatin from bones that cannot be accessed through roasting. This technique provided a dense, nutrient-rich broth that offered warmth, hydration, and essential calories, especially valuable in conditions where dehydration risk increased due to cold, dry air. Fish and aquatic resources supplemented this diet wherever water remained accessible. Archaeological traces show occasional fish bones, suggesting that humans took advantage of ice-free springs, river openings, and coastal refuges. Fish added important fatty acids and vitamins that were otherwise limited in a meat-dominated diet. In some regions, shellfish may have been collected when coastal platforms became exposed due to lower sea levels. Small animals, hare, fox, ptarmigan, became important both for meat and for their hides. These species breed quickly and can sustain populations even under harsh conditions. Their remains increase in cold phase sites, indicating that humans strategically targeted them to stabilize food supply. This diversification helped reduce dependence on large game migrations, which could become unpredictable during prolonged cold. This diet had physiological consequences. High fat intake supported thermogenesis, the metabolic process of generating body heat. Humans living in extended winter entered deeper metabolic adaptation, similar to what is seen in modern Arctic populations. Genetic studies of contemporary cold-adapted groups revealed traits that improve fat metabolism, such as variants in genes related to lipid processing. While ancient DNA from prolonged winter periods is scarce, the patterns of survival suggest that individuals who metabolize fat efficiently had a better chance of enduring severe conditions. Body proportions also shifted over generations. Populations in colder regions developed shorter limbs and broader torsos, traits that reduce surface area relative to body mass, helping retain heat. These patterns match Bergman's and Allen's ecological rules describing body shape adaptations to climate. Skeletal remains from cold-adapted Pleistocene populations support this trend, showing more robust builds compared to those from warmer regions. Health challenges increased under prolonged winter. Vitamin deficiencies became a risk, particularly for nutrients normally obtained from plants. Humans compensated through organ consumption. Liver provides vitamin A. Bones and marrow offer minerals. Certain meats contain trace vitamins. And even small amounts of fermented or partially frozen plant matter may have supplied essential nutrients. These strategies helped prevent deficiencies that could otherwise weaken immune systems during demanding conditions. Cold stress also increased caloric requirements. In extreme environments, the human body may need up to 5,000 calories per day to maintain heat, especially during physical activity such as hunting. The high-fat diet, combined with efficient food processing, allowed humans to meet these demands. Groups that stored meat and fat during brief warmer periods were better equipped for sudden storms or extended blizzards that restricted mobility. Hydration was another hidden challenge. Despite the abundance of snow and ice, melting it for water requires energy. Humans often relied on broth, blood, and moisture extracted from food to stay hydrated efficiently. Snow was melted sparingly, usually near a fire or by using heated stones. Dehydration could occur quickly in cold environments due to increased respiration rates and dry air, making hydration strategies essential. Disease patterns shifted during prolonged cold. Many pathogens struggle to survive in low temperatures, reducing certain infectious diseases. However, respiratory issues increased due to cold air and smoke inhalation inside enclosed shelters. Hearth smoke left microscopic traces on bones and teeth, indicating long-term exposure. Crowded shelters also increased the spread of minor respiratory ailments, though overall infectious disease load was likely lower than in warmer, denser populations. Even psychological health adapted. Extended darkness and confinement shaped daily routines. Storytelling, structured tasks, and social bonding helped maintain mental resilience. These behaviors left no direct archaeological trace, but were essential for keeping morale stable during months of limited outdoor activity. By the middle of a generation-long winter, humans had developed a fully integrated nutritional and metabolic system suited to extreme cold. Their diet, physiology, and daily practices formed a coherent survival strategy, one that supported not only individuals, but entire communities. As this understanding settles, the next segment begins to form, exploring how prolonged winter shaped early human genetics, population bottlenecks, and evolutionary pathways that influenced later peoples. A winter that lasts for decades does more than reshape landscapes and cultures. It leaves measurable marks on human genetics. Extended cold compresses populations into smaller, isolated refugees, changes survival pressures, and amplifies the impact of natural selection. Over time, these pressures produce genetic signatures that continue into later populations. A generation-long winter is not simply a climate event. It is an evolutionary moment. To understand this, you look at three interconnected processes: population bottlenecks, selection, pressures, and gene flow between surviving groups. The first process is the bottleneck effect. When harsh climate forces people into smaller habitable regions, population sizes shrink. A group that once ranged across thousands of kilometers might contract into a valley, a river corridor, or a sheltered coastal zone. Archaeological evidence for these contracted populations appears in regions with dense clusters of repeated occupation: Southern Europe, the Levant, parts of Central Asia, and some East Asian refugees. These areas contain more continuous human presence during severe cold, while surrounding regions show abandonment. Genetic studies of modern humans reveal traces of ancient bottlenecks, reduced genetic diversity in some populations that can be traced back to Ice Age climate events. These bottlenecks do not imply extinction risk. Rather, they reflect periods when only part of the population contributed significantly to future generations. A prolonged winter intensifies this effect. Groups unable to adapt or migrate effectively disappear from the record, while those in more stable refuges become the ancestors of later expansions. Within these refuges, survival pressures were relentless. Selection favored individuals with traits that improved endurance in cold conditions, both physically and behaviorally. Some traits were physiological: more efficient fat metabolism, stronger thermoregulation, or body proportions suited for heat conservation. Genetic variants related to cold adaptation still exist today in Arctic populations. While not all of these adaptations originated in a single event, prolonged winters throughout the Pleistocene contributed to shaping them. Other traits were behavioral and cognitive. Individuals who cooperated well, learned quickly, or remembered seasonal patterns had better chances of surviving a winter that demanded constant planning. These behaviors do not leave direct genetic markers, but they influence survival and reproduction indirectly. Groups with strong communication systems and effective teaching traditions maintained higher stability, allowing cultural knowledge to persist. Gene flow, the exchange of genetic material between groups, remained active even under severe cold. Climate refugees drew multiple groups into shared territory. This forced proximity increased intermarriage and genetic mixing. Ancient DNA shows that many modern populations descend from blended lineages formed during cold phase refuges. These merging events were not always permanent. Groups eventually split again as climates improved, but the genetic signatures remained, shaping the ancestral landscape of Eurasia, Africa, and parts of Asia. These mixing events also accelerated cultural and technological exchange. When different groups with different tool traditions shared territory, innovations spread quickly. A generation-long winter intensified these interactions because groups had fewer alternatives. Cooperation and exchange became survival strategies. Genetic and cultural diversity within refugees increased, while diversity outside them declined as peripheral populations diminished. Another evolutionary factor was demographic structure. During prolonged cold, age distribution changed. Infant mortality increased due to harsh conditions, but individuals who survived childhood often lived long enough to pass on knowledge and genetic traits. This skewed age structure shaped cultural continuity. Elders, holding essential ecological knowledge, became central to survival. Their influence on group decisions played a subtle evolutionary role, preserving behavioral strategies that worked under extreme winter. Migration routes created long-term genetic pathways as well. When the winter eventually ended, populations expanded outward from the refugees. These expansions carried the genetic signatures of bottleneck groups into new territories. Archaeologists see this pattern in the uniformity of post-glacial tool cultures across Europe and Asia, and geneticists see it in the spread of certain mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages that trace back to Ice Age refuges. The long winter may also have contributed to the decline or extinction of other human species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other hominin groups faced the same climate pressures, but with different population sizes and adaptive capacities. While the final disappearance of Neanderthals is linked to multiple factors, climate instability, low population density, and competition, prolonged cold phases likely played a significant role in reducing their range and limiting their recovery. Modern humans, with flexible diets, broader social networks, and adaptable technology, were better positioned to survive the generation-long cold. Their success during these periods helped cement their dominance across continents. As the climate began to warm again, the surviving human populations emerged with renewed genetic diversity, strengthened cultural systems, and technologies refined through decades of harsh living. These populations formed the starting point for the cultural and demographic expansions that reshaped the world after the Ice Age. And as this evolutionary understanding settles, the next segment begins to form, exploring how the long winter finally ended, what triggered the transition back to warmer conditions, and how humans responded to a world that began to thaw. A winter that lasts a generation does not fade slowly. It ends much like it begins, abruptly. In the climate record, the transition from extreme cold back to warmer conditions appears as a sharp rise in temperatures, sometimes occurring within a single decade. When you examine ice cores, ocean sediments, and pollen records, this moment stands out clearly. An environmental system locked in deep cold suddenly releases, reshaping ecosystems, water cycles, and human lifeways almost overnight. The primary driver of such rapid warming is the restoration of the thermohaline circulation. During the long winter, the North Atlantic's heat conveyor had slowed or collapsed due to the influx of fresh water from melting glaciers. But this shutdown is inherently unstable. Over time, fresh water disperses, sea ice retreats slightly, and salinity levels begin to recover. When they reach a critical threshold, the ocean's circulation restarts, sending warm currents northward again. This change releases stored heat into the atmosphere, triggering a rapid rise in temperatures. Ice core data shows this process clearly. Within just a few layers of annual snowfall, oxygen isotope ratios shift dramatically, marking a sudden warming event. Methane levels rise as wetlands expand, indicating ecological rebound. Dust concentrations fall, showing a decrease in the storm activity typical of frozen landscapes. The warming does not occur uniformly across the planet, but northern regions experience the most dramatic transformation. As temperatures climb, snow cover melts earlier each year. Darker ground absorbs more sunlight, accelerating the warming. Plants respond quickly. Within a few short years, species that had retreated south begin to reappear. Shrubs reclaim tundra, grasses spread across plains. Pollen records show rapid increases in birch, pine, and other temperate species. These changes create new environments that attract animals back into regions they abandoned. Megafauna respond next. Reindeer remain in many areas, but shift their ranges. Horses move into newly formed grasslands. Mammoths, in regions where they still survive, migrate northward or into higher elevations as warmth spreads. Their presence reshapes predator behavior, including human hunting strategies. The ecological rebound, though rapid, is uneven. Some species flourish, while others decline or shift to follow familiar plant communities. Water systems transform as well. Rivers swell with meltwater, lakes expand, ice dams break, sometimes catastrophically, sending floods through valleys. These floods deposit fertile sediments, creating new resource-rich environments. Humans who had survived decades of scarcity suddenly encounter landscapes filled with opportunities. Abundant plant foods, predictable water sources, and expanding animal populations. The warming also changes human movement. Territories abandoned during the long winter become accessible again. Campsites that had lain dormant beneath snow are revisited. Stone tool traditions spread outward from the refuges where populations had gathered. Archaeological sites show increased occupation north of the previous cold boundary, marking the start of re-expansion. Groups move into new areas, following game, exploring fresh grasslands, and rediscovering rivers that had been frozen for most of their lives. Technologies shift quickly as well. Clothing becomes lighter, though hide garments remain important for unpredictable cold snaps. Hunting tools diversify. Fishing increases as rivers become free-flowing. New techniques appear for processing plant foods that are returning to the landscape. Grinding stones become more common. Storage pits grow deeper and more structured. Toolmakers produce more varied tools, reflecting the broader range of tasks now required in a warming world. Social dynamics change too. The pressure that once forced groups into tight, cooperative clusters begins to ease. Some groups split into smaller bands to take advantage of expanding territories. Others stay together, forming the core of what will later become more complex societies. Genetic diversity spreads outward as populations migrate into new areas. Cultural traditions rooted in cold survival mix with emerging practices suited to warmer climates. For children born during the long winter, the warming must have felt like entering an entirely different world. Rivers that had been frozen for most of their lives now filled with water. Plants they had never seen returned. Animals moved in patterns unfamiliar to their parents. Their cultural knowledge had to adjust quickly. Teaching systems expanded to include new resources, new dangers, and new opportunities. As humans adapted to this rebound, the environment continued to reorganize. Forests spread, grasslands stabilized, coastlines shifted as glacial meltwater raised sea levels. Entire regions that had once been walkable land became submerged. The world was not simply returning to what it had been before the winter. It was becoming something new. The end of the long winter marks a turning point in human history. The skills developed under cold, cooperation, planning, clothing technology, advanced hunting strategies, did not disappear. Instead, they provided the foundation for new ways of living. As the climate warmed, humans applied these survival tools to richer landscapes, creating the conditions that would eventually support permanent settlements, broader trade, and complex cultural traditions. With this transition understood, the next segment begins to form, examining how humans expanded into newly thawed territories, reshaped their cultural identities, and rebuilt populations in the first centuries after the winter's end. When a winter lasting a generation finally ends, the world does not return to what it was before. It becomes something transformed. The thaw sets off a cascade of ecological changes, and humans, shaped by decades of cold-adapted living, begin to move outward again. This re-expansion marks one of the most dynamic phases in deep human history. Populations recovering, landscapes reopening, and cultural systems adjusting to resources unseen for decades. The first sign of re-expansion is the appearance of new archaeological layers north of the former cold boundary. Sites that had been abandoned suddenly show renewed occupation. Fresh hearths appear above sterile winter layers. Stone flakes scatter across reopened valleys. These traces indicate that people moved quickly into territories made accessible by melting snow and receding ice. In some regions, this reoccupation happened within just a few years of the warming event. Humans followed animals first. Reindeer shifted their grazing routes as tundra plants re-emerged. Horses returned to growing grasslands. Bison expanded into newly fertile areas. Humans tracking these herds left behind characteristic hunting debris, broken points, butchering marks, and temporary shelters. The speed of this movement shows how deeply humans depended on herd behavior. When animals moved, people followed. Plant resources also shaped re-expansion. As grasses, shrubs, and early flowering plants returned, they created zones rich in seasonal foods. Humans who had survived the long winter with mostly meat-based diets now incorporated plant foods again. Grinding stones, once rare, became more common. Seeds and nuts re-entered the diet. These changes show that humans were not locked into a cold, adapted niche. They were flexible, ready to shift strategies as soon as the environment allowed. Rivers played a critical role. As ice melted, these waterways transformed from static frozen lines into dynamic corridors filled with fish, fresh water, and fertile floodplains. Human groups settled temporarily along these rivers during re-expansion, benefiting from predictable resources. Fishing tools diversify in sites from this period. Barbed points, bone hooks, and stone net weights appear more frequently. The return of fish into human diets improved nutrient balance, helping populations recover from decades of restricted food options. Population growth followed quickly. Genetic modeling shows that human numbers increased dramatically after major cold phases. Warmer climates boosted plant productivity, which supported larger herbivore populations and, in turn, larger human groups. As populations expanded, they split. One group might remain in a refuge area, while another moved into newly thawed regions. These splits created branching lineages, the early seeds of regional diversity in post-glacial cultures. Cultural identities evolved with this movement. Groups that had merged during the winter often divided again, carrying blended tool traditions into new territories. The archaeological record reflects this. Similar blade styles appear across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers, evidence of shared ancestry. As these populations settled into different landscapes, subtle cultural differences emerged, variations in tool shapes, hunting strategies, and seasonal movements. Re-expansion also reshaped social networks. During the winter, Groups relied heavily on cooperation and shared resources. As the world opened up, these networks expanded outward. Trade routes reformed. Stone types from distant sources begin appearing again in new sites. This indicates long-distance contact, either through traveling groups or exchange chains created through repeated intergroup encounters. These networks were the early framework for the interaction spheres that later supported agriculture and trade. Childhood changed too. Children born after the thaw grew up in landscapes far richer and easier to navigate than those of their parents. Their learning emphasized new foods, new environments, and new dangers. They learned to identify edible plants, to fish in rivers, and to track animals through thawing soil instead of deep snow. Their upbringing was shaped not by constant scarcity, but by expanding opportunity. Physical health improved as well. Diets diversified. Energy demands decreased as temperatures rose. Shelters no longer required extreme insulation. Respiratory issues linked to smoke-filled winter shelters became less common as groups spent more time outdoors. Population density increased without the same survival stress that had compressed groups during the cold years. Re-expansion helped reset ecological relationships. Humans revisited old territories, discovered new ones, and adapted quickly to shifting ecosystems. Some groups followed newly exposed coastal plains made accessible by still low sea levels. Others moved inland, tracking animals through expanding forests. These choices determined long-term cultural trajectories. Coastal groups developed strong fishing traditions. Inland groups perfected big game hunting strategies. River-based groups blended both. As generations passed, the memory of the long winter remained deeply embedded in cultural knowledge. Stories of extreme cold may have circulated as warnings. Skills developed during the winter, clothing manufacture, food storage, coordinated hunting, remained valuable even in warmer times. The resilience built during hardship continued to shape societies long after the climate stabilized. The re-expansion phase lasted centuries. By the end of it, humans were distributed across vast territories again. Their technologies had diversified, their populations had grown, and their social structures had matured in ways that would influence the next great shift in human history, the emergence of early settled life. And as this phase settles in your mind, the next segment forms, examining how the rich post-winter landscapes supported the earliest experiments in seasonal settlement, resource management, and the gradual steps toward permanent communities. As the world warmed after a generation-long winter, humans stepped into landscapes transformed by thawing ice, expanding forests, and fertile plains. These environments were richer than anything the previous generation had known, filled with new plant species, stable rivers, and thriving animal populations. For the first time in decades, the environment allowed something extraordinary, the possibility of staying in one place for longer than a season. This shift did not create permanent settlements overnight, but it marked the beginning of seasonal stability, a crucial transitional period that paved the way for the agricultural and village-based societies that would emerge thousands of years later. The first sign of this stability is the appearance of seasonally reused sites. Archaeological layers from this period show repeated occupation in the same place during specific times of year. Groups might return every spring to a river valley with abundant fish, or every autumn to a forest known for nuts and migrating animals. These repeated visits left behind deeper deposits, multiple fire pits, larger accumulations of tools, and thicker layers of butchered bone. People were still mobile, but their movements were now cyclical rather than reactive. Shelters became sturdier as well. Instead of quickly assembled structures meant to last a few days or weeks, groups built semi-permanent frameworks, wooden posts sunk into the ground, stone foundations to support walls, and durable windbreaks. These structures were designed to survive the winter unoccupied and be reused the following year. Although wood and hide coverings have decayed, the post holes and soil stains remain, showing deliberate planning and investment. Food resources supported this stability. As forests expanded, plant diversity increased dramatically. Berries, nuts, and edible roots returned to many regions. Seed-bearing grasses spread across open plains. Humans took advantage of these foods, developing new processing techniques. Grinding stones, once rare, became common tools for preparing plant-based meals. Hearths show signs of varied cooking practices, including roasting, boiling, and baking with heated stones. Animal populations supported long-term seasonal use of territories. Reindeer herds maintained predictable routes. Horses and bison grazed on expanding grasslands. Birds migrated in patterns that returned reliability to hunting seasons. Fish migrations along thawed rivers created rich, seasonal concentrations. Humans learned these patterns quickly, building knowledge networks that guided yearly movements. With stability came changes in community structure. Groups grew larger. Extended families traveled together, benefiting from shared work and resources. The crowding of winter refugees had strengthened cooperation, and those social systems remained in place even as the world warmed. Now, however, cooperation served new purposes: shared construction projects, coordinated hunting drives, and collective food processing events. Larger groups generated more cultural continuity. Tool styles became more uniform within regions. Decorations carved into bone or antler show early regional identities taking shape. The increased population density in fertile areas also encouraged broader exchange networks. Groups traded stone, pigments, crafted items, and knowledge across wider areas. These interactions laid the groundwork for later, more formal trade routes. One of the most important developments during this period was short-term food storage. Humans who had learned to preserve meat during the long winter now applied those skills in warmer seasons. They dried fish, cached nuts, and stored seeds in pits. These storage practices allowed groups to remain in one place longer, reducing the pressure to move immediately when local resources ran low. Storage marks the beginning of delayed return economies, systems where effort today benefits the future. Another shift was in landscape management. Humans began to influence the environment deliberately. By burning patches of vegetation, they encouraged new plant growth attractive to grazing animals. This practice, known from ethnographic parallels and supported by charcoal layers in certain regions, helped shape ecosystems in ways that improved hunting opportunities. These early environmental manipulations foreshadow the much later practices of farming and herding. As stability increased, symbolic expression grew stronger. Ornaments, carvings, and pigments become more visible in the archaeological record. These items may have marked group identity, social roles, or seasonal rituals tied to returning to the same place year after year. The reappearance of symbolic behavior is not separate from environmental change. It is a direct response to having the time, resources, and social structure necessary to maintain traditions. Children growing up in these post-winter landscapes experienced a very different world from their parents. They learned about abundant plants, reliable rivers, and predictable seasons. Their education involved new tools, new foods, and new knowledge about land use. These children formed the first generation to grow up outside of crisis, carrying forward survival strategies learned during the winter, but adapting them to a more generous world. As groups continued returning to favored places, some stayed slightly longer each year, building shelters more thoroughly, storing more food, and mapping nearby resources. These behaviors represent the earliest steps towards sedentism, a slow shift from nomadic survival to anchored community life. By the end of this phase, the seeds of stability had been planted. Humans were not yet farmers, but they were no longer purely wanderers. The landscapes that emerged from the thaw supported longer stays, larger groups, and expanding cultural identities. These conditions created the foundation upon which early settlements and eventually agriculture would grow. As this transition settles in your mind, the final segment begins to form, exploring how the long winter's legacy shaped the first true settlements, early plant tending, animal management, and the beginnings of the societies that would reshape human history. By the time a generation-long winter had fully released its grip on the world, humans were stepping into landscapes that were not simply warmer, they were fundamentally reorganized. Ecosystems had been reset, species distributions shifted, rivers carved new channels, forests expanded into ground that had been barren for decades, and humans, carrying the skills and survival systems forged in extreme cold, began shaping a new chapter in their own history. The long winter did not create farming or permanent settlements, but it produced the conditions and behaviors that made these developments possible. As populations expanded out of their cold refuges, they encountered landscapes rich in wild grains, nuts, fish, and grazing animals. The people who had survived the long winter were uniquely prepared for this abundance. They had honed planning skills, developed clothing for diverse climates, mastered food storage, refined cooperation, and organized their tasks with precision. These abilities, initially born from necessity, now supported a shift towards stability. Seasonal camps in fertile regions gradually became semi-permanent settlements. Archaeological layers from the warming periods show structures rebuilt in the same locations year after year, sometimes for centuries. Post holes deepen, hearths multiply, trash middens grow. Food processing areas become more specialized. These patterns mark a slow but unmistakable transition. People began staying long enough for their presence to alter the landscape itself. Food storage played a crucial role. The same techniques used to survive the long winter, drying, smoking, catching, now allowed humans to manage surpluses during warmer seasons. When wild grains ripened in abundance, groups collected more than they needed immediately. They stored seeds in pits lined with stone or clay. These storage pits, preserved in soil layers, are among the earliest signals of the behavioral shift that would eventually lead to agricultural experimentation. Over time, stored seeds sometimes sprouted near camps. Humans noticed. They learned which patches produced the best growth and returned to those patches season after season. Some groups cleared competing vegetation, deliberately or accidentally creating better growing environments. These accidental selection pressures set the earliest foundation for plant domestication long before deliberate farming took shape. Animals, too, responded to human stability. Herds of gazelle, cattle, goat, and boar began frequenting areas near human camps, drawn by discarded food, cleared vegetation, or the safety of open areas. Humans observed their behavior, predicted their movements, and adapted hunting strategies accordingly. In some regions, these interactions eventually developed into early herd management practices. Not domestication yet, but the beginnings of controlled interaction between humans and animals. Technological innovation accelerated in this new context. With more predictable living spaces, toolmakers produced heavier grinding stones, larger storage vessels, and more durable woodworking tools. Bone and antler carving flourished. Stone points diversified into types used for different hunting ranges and prey sizes. Fishing gear improved as communities began relying on rivers and lakes for consistent food sources. These technological shifts reflect the confidence that comes from stability, the awareness that a tool made today will still be useful tomorrow. Social structures deepened as well. Groups that once merged under winter stress now formed stable multifamily communities. Leadership roles evolved, often based on knowledge rather than brute strength. Individuals who understood animal migrations, plant cycles, or construction techniques gained influence. Elders continued to serve as living repositories of memory. With more people living together for longer periods, conflict resolution, cooperation, and shared ritual practices became more formalized. Symbolic expression found fertile ground in these stable settings. Carved objects, beads, pigments, and early ritual features appear more frequently in archaeological layers associated with post-winter stability. When people stayed in one place for long enough, symbols gained continuity, reinforcing identity, marking seasons, or commemorating events. These expressions reflected a culture no longer living in crisis, but growing into complexity. Children growing up in this era became the first generation with both the survival knowledge of the long winter and the opportunity to apply it to abundant landscapes. They learned not only how to hunt, track, and sow, but also how to gather plants, process seeds, and maintain long-term camps. Their daily experience blended resilience with opportunity. They were the bridge between harsh Ice Age survival and the beginnings of settled life. As centuries passed, these stable seasonal camps expanded. Shelters grew sturdier, food stores increased, landscapes became managed, even engineered by human hands. Small patches of tended plants gradually became cultivated fields. Groups began to rely on certain resources, enough to remain near them year-round. What had started as a response to abundance slowly evolved into true sedentarism, a commitment to place that formed the backbone of early agricultural societies. The legacy of the long winter is clear. It selected for resilience, cooperation, planning, and innovation, the very qualities needed to transition from mobile foragers into settled communities capable of shaping their environment. Without the pressures of prolonged cold, humans might still have advanced over time. But the experience of surviving a world locked in winter forced them to develop the cognitive, technological, and social foundations that made the next great shift: agriculture, villages, and eventually civilization, not only possible, but inevitable. And so the generation-long winter far from being merely a period of hardship, becomes a turning point in deep history, a test that refined humanity, shaped its capabilities, and prepared it for the world it would soon begin to build.